Good morning. It is Wednesday, the 4th of March. I'm Maeve McMahon, and this is Europe Today, your daily dose of European news and analysis right here on Euronews. Coming up, all eyes on the war with Iran, which enters its fifth day today. Overnight, strikes were reported in Iran and Lebanon, with the Iranian Red Crescent saying the death toll in Iran could soon be at 1,000. In Lebanon, meanwhile, more than 30,000 people have been displaced by the escalating violence. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates says it's been targeted by more than 1,000 attacks from Iran. And for his part, President Zelensky of Ukraine has pledged to send drone interceptors to the Middle East if regional leaders persuade Russia to end its war in Ukraine. And in Washington, President Donald Trump has warned the fighting could continue for weeks. This as Iran warns Europe to stay out of the conflict or face retaliation. For more on this, we can head straight over to Dubai, where our correspondent is standing by because, of course, Iranian drones and missile attacks have been fired towards the UAE in the past few days in response to the US-Israeli strikes on Iran. And while most attacks have been intercepted, some buildings there have, of course, been damaged, including the US consulate and Dubai International Airport. So, Jane, what is the situation there this morning?
Good morning. As you mentioned, the US consulate here in Dubai Creek was hit overnight by a drone, resulting in a fire. Now, the UAE and Qatar are very much aligned that Iran has crossed a red line and, in fact, has lost its compass. The other breaking news overnight was that two Iranian sleeper cells were arrested in Qatar. And this will obviously send ruffles through the security community that there could be other Revolutionary Guard operatives active in other countries. Now, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Dubai and also in Doha held press conferences yesterday, reassuring people that they have enough air defence ammunition to protect the countries.
And of course, Jane,
we announced this repeatedly to the public, and we want to reassure the public again. And if they hear pops and sounds coming out of the sky, that's actually a comforting sound. It's a comforting noise. What it means that the air defense system is functioning properly to intercept, destroy all of these threats. Silence is actually not good.
Very disconcerting there, Jane, for people in Dubai. We all know Dubai, of course, as a magnet for both tourists and investors. Tell us, what about the people who've been stranded there in Dubai for the last couple of days?
Well, of course, those repatriation flights are continuing out of DXB Airport. In fact, I had friends who were on the DXB to London flight at 7:45 this morning. They told me it was pretty fluid going through the airport, very organised, which is pretty amazing considering, as you mentioned earlier, the airport was struck twice over the weekend on Saturday night into Sunday morning. Now, the other interesting thing that we're seeing here, it's not just people leaving the country. We are seeing repatriation flights back into the UAE as people wish to return home.
OK. Jane Witherspoon, thank you so much there for that live update from Dubai. We'll keep, of course, a very close eye on the situation. Now, speaking alongside the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in DC, President Donald Trump threatened to end trade ties with Spain, citing a lack of support over the European Union and Israel, or over the US and Israel attacks on Iran. Pedro Sanchez's socialist government said the conflict was unjustified and illegal. For more on this story, we can bring in our very own EU editor, Maria Tadeo, who's actually in Luxembourg for us this morning, reporting from the European Investment Bank talks. So, Maria, quite an escalation now between the US and Spain. Is there a ramp-off anyway, or any way to de-escalate here?
Well, look, at this point, yes, the president of the U.S. lashed at Spain yesterday, saying that this is a country that has not been supportive in this military operation. Also, remember, at the start of the week, the Spanish government said that it would not allow the bases located that belong to the U.S. in Spain to be used in this operation, and then went on to say, ultimately, at this point, I will instruct the U.S. Treasury Secretary to cut all ties with Spain. That is the equivalent of an economy minister, of a finance minister, when it comes to the European Union. Of course, before we get into the details, Maeve, I think at this point, let's recap what happened last night, and then we can go into details.
Spain has been terrible. In fact, I told Scott to cut off all dealings with Spain. Spain, first of all, It started when every European nation, at my request, paid 5%, which they should be doing. And everybody was enthusiastic about it, Germany, everybody. And Spain didn't do it. And now Spain actually said that we can't use their bases. And that's all right. We could use their base if we want. We could just fly in and use it. Nobody's going to tell us not to use it. But we don't have to. But they were unfriendly. So we're going to cut off all trade with Spain. We don't want anything to do with Spain.
And that was, of course, the president of the U.S. saying he will now instruct what seems to be a sort of trade embargo on the country. However, yesterday night, sources close to the Spanish government told me that they believe that Spain is a reliable ally to NATO. They also said that there is a mutually beneficial relationship between the U.S. and Spain. If the United States wants to change that unilaterally, they will have to comply with international law. The fact that these are private companies operating among the two sides, and also the fact that there is a standing deal between the U.S. and the European Union. Sources close to the Spanish government also told me that at this point, Madrid does not seem to be panicking, ultimately saying if there are any repercussions to businesses at this point, they believe they can shield them with aid, but also by diversifying the supply chain. Nonetheless, of course, this is a very political story at this stage. For companies, it is a source of uncertainty. We know the Spanish Prime Minister will address the media at 9 p.m., but it is also political, and I would note, to an extent, also suitable for both. For President Trump, this is a message to his audience, but also the Spanish Prime Minister, this is also a message to his audience saying, I am the progressive man on the left, and I will face, if I have to, the President of the U.S.
OK, Maria Tadeo, Euronews' EU editor there live from Luxembourg. Thank you so much for that update. We will come back to you a little bit later, though, in the programme. But now, EU heads of state and government are not planning any emergency EU summit on Iran for the time being. But the new Dutch Prime Minister, Rob Jetten, did pay a visit to the EU capital to introduce himself to the political establishment. Euronews' Jorge Lebrero asked the new Prime Minister what impact the war was having on the European Union and if there were any plans to hold emergency talks.
Obviously, the Iran war can have a big impact on strategic reserves, not only in Europe, but also in Asia. So we have to prepare ourselves for any case that this war will continue for many more weeks and impacts also the strategic reserves in the Netherlands and abroad. I think the broader concern is what this war and everything that's going on in the Strait of Hormuz is going to affect in terms of pricing. So that will be obviously a part of the agenda in the council meetings.
Rob Jetten there, the new Dutch Prime Minister, a new face on the EU circuit, alluding there to the importance of the Strait of Hormuz. For more on this, our reporter Jakob Janis has been taking a closer look at why exactly the Strait of Hormuz is so strategic for global trade.
At Euronews, we usually report big politics, but this time your reporter wants to ask a different question. How the Middle East conflict will affect your wallet? Recently, following US and Israeli strikes, Iran has moved to block the Strait of Hormuz. And what you need to know is that this is the ultimate geopolitical choke point, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Let's investigate the economic impact. Let's start with an easy question. Do you have a car? Because 20 million barrels of oil squeeze through this narrow strait every single day. And as drone attacks halt major shipping, global oil prices have surged. This means immediate price hikes at the pump and rising supermarket inflation, since shipping everyday goods will simply cost more. And what about your house? Because the strait is not just for oil. A massive portion of global LNG relies on this route. And following the attacks, Qatar halted its LNG facilities, sending European gas prices up to the moon. And since Europe needs this gas for heating and electricity, expect higher household bills. Finally, the timing could not be worse for Europe, as the continent now relies on shipped LNG. And as European reserves are dangerously low right now, a sustained blockade leaves the EU exposed to high price spikes. And that's not great. And climate activists argue this crisis exposes the true weaknesses of a world chained to fossil fuels. They are pushing for a faster shift to homegrown renewables to escape the geopolitical shocks exactly like this one. However, until that energy transition happens, it seems this tiny maritime choke point will dictate the cost of living for you and for me.
Jakob Yanis there reporting for us on how this conflict, the longer it persists, the higher wholesale costs will feed through to, of course, our household bills and indeed the wider economy. For more on this angle, we can cross now back to Luxembourg to the European Investment Bank, where Euronews' EU editor Maria Tadeo is standing by for us.
Yes, Maeve, good morning. We are here in Luxembourg at the annual European Investment Bank conference, A Stronger Europe in a Changing World. And to debrief, we are joined by the president of the bank, of course, and that is Nadia Calvino. Thank you very much for joining us today. We just heard on the show, however, this is a complex moment for Europe. Gas prices went up 50% on one day, added another 30% on a second day. Energy is the weakest point for the European Union. You talk about a stronger economy. Can Europe really stay strong in this very volatile context?
I think that the current escalation of the conflict in the Middle East makes it more urgent than ever that Europe reinforces its strategic autonomy, whether it's in the area of energy or security and defense. In the last 4 years, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Europe has become much more resilient, much more independent. European companies have proven to adjust and to be flexible, to adapt to these changing conditions. And so I'm confident that this time around we will also be able to tackle this challenge.
But do you worry, however, that this could, of course, there's many uncertainties and it's unclear how long this war is going to go on, or even if Europe will have to participate in a more active way. But are you concerned, perhaps, as this is another energy shock to a European Union already shocked from this escalation of prices in gas and cutting away from Russia? Is that something that you worry about at this stage?
But, it's not only about Europe. I think that war is destabilizing the global economy. Tensions, conflicts that we're seeing in these last years are obviously not conducive to a framework and to an environment of stability, peace and investment. So as European Investment Bank, what we do is obviously to support strategic investments in Europe and also contribute to a more peaceful, more stable world around us.
And of course, yesterday in your speech in which you said Europe needs to go bigger and now much faster too, it is clear there's a connection now with the economy, the single market, and of course, defense. You can play that double feature and that double role with the European Investment Bank spending more money in loans into defense. Is that something where you believe this year you could become that defense bank? Many around the table in Europe want you to do that.
Well, 2025 was a turning point for the European Investment Bank in terms of financing security and defense. We already reached 5% of our finance inside the EU devoted to this sector. We have a very robust pipeline of projects. We will continue on the same track, but each player needs to play its role. We're not the defense ministry, so the European Commission, the European Defense Agency, NATO.
So you don't see yourself as a defense bank. You see yourself as a multiple bank. You don't want to be the European Defense Bank for a European security union, perhaps. That's not what you see your role being at this point.
We are the European Investment Bank, so we are the financial arm of the European Union, contributing, putting the money where our mouth is, and supporting European priorities.
And you've had a lot of CEOs in this conference. One of them is, of course, Mistral, the artificial intelligence unicorn. Now, big hope for the Europeans to stay in the game. What are CEOs telling you that they need from you? Ultimately, it is about the companies.
Well, the main message we're getting from business leaders, and I'm really grateful and impressed that with all that's going on around us in the world, actually we gathered here in Luxembourg a stellar lineup of speakers, institution leaders, top managers of leading companies, also investors. It's really the exchanges we're having are extremely productive and rich. And what the business community is telling us is we need large-scale finance to scale up. Europe has leading technologies, incredible talent, research capabilities, also a very vibrant ecosystem of startups and growing companies. What we need is large-scale venture debt, venture capital investments that can allow these companies to grow into global leaders.
Because otherwise they list in America, they go to New York. And speaking of America, however, I have to ask you just as a final question. Of course, you've had a long career working in the European Commission. You also served as finance minister and economy minister in Spain under the government of Pedro Sanchez. Obviously, there's now a lot of tensions between the two sides. I'm sure you saw the news yesterday, full embargoed on the Spanish economy, according to the U.S. president. Do you have any reaction?
Well, obviously, Europe is speaking with one voice in this area. We are united when it comes to trade, when it comes to the economy, and more generally, I think that we all benefit from respecting international law and trying to contribute to peace around the world. This has served us well for the last 80 years, and we should continue on that track. The European Union is a force for good, a force for stability, for win-win partnerships, for peace, and I am quite sure that we will continue to try to de-escalate current tensions and find positive ways out.
Well, let's see about that de-escalation. Thank you so much, President, for joining. And of course, Maeve, this forum continues now. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Maria Tadeo. And of course, to your guest there, Nadia Calvino, the President of the European Investment Bank. But now for the view from the United Nations. Coming up, we'll be joined by Jorge Moreira da Silva, the United Nations Under-Secretary General and the Executive Director of the UN for Project Services. A former politician back home in his native Portugal, Jorge Moreira da Silva also had a stint as a government minister and is a former member of the European Parliament. So good morning, Jorge. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Good morning, Maeve.
Look, can the Middle East cope with yet another conflict?
No, and we can't live in an era of rock and hard power. The UN Charter is the way forward, and the chart of the UN clearly says that the member states must find within diplomacy the way to settle their disputes, and that's why we condemn.
Diplomacy is not working now. Who and how can this war be ended?
Oh, it must work, and that's why it's important that everyone puts pressure on the right side, and the right side is bringing parties back to the table and to ensure that we cease these hostilities. Because, as you said, another war on the top of a region that is already highly fragile will have effects that are unpredictable. Look, a few months ago we were talking about Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza. Can we imagine what will be the impact, not only globally, as we just heard from Nadia Calvino, but in the region, particularly for the people? 90% of the people in Syria live under poverty. 40% in Lebanon live under poverty. 40% in Iran live under poverty. In Gaza, there is a tragic humanitarian crisis. So this new tension in the Middle East will have, as always, disproportionate effects on the poorest. It always affects more the poorest.
And we've seen thousands of people already fleeing Lebanon. Should we expect to see more movements like this?
Yes, I think that unfortunately forced displacement and the refugee crisis are always triggered by conflicts and fragility.
And is the European Union ready for that?
I think that nobody is ready for that, and that's why rather than addressing consequences or entering into scenarios about what will happen in case there is forced displacement, what will happen in case there is a massive impact on the energy sector, I think that we need to do whatever we can to de-escalate, to stop hostilities, and in the meantime, it's also important to respect fully the international law. And namely,
this war was just initiated a couple of days after the big launch of Donald Trump's Board of Peace in DC. What's your view of the Board of Peace? Is it undermining your role at the UN?
Well, our position at UN about the Board of Peace is very clear. It's framed within a Security Council resolution. That's why in the context of Gaza, because the Board of Peace is in the context of Gaza, that it was framed in a Security Council resolution, is opening discussions about reconstruction in Gaza. But the problem is, I visited Gaza months ago. I visited Gaza already 3 times in the last 28 months. And what I'm hearing from the people in Gaza is not expectations about reconstruction. Of course, they will want reconstruction, but they are more focused on what can I get now. The children I saw, the 700,000 kids without access to education, the people living in improper, unsafe tents, the people in the middle of the rubble, what they want is removing of the rubble, removing of the mines and explosives, bringing shelters, proper shelters, repairing the power station.
And the attention, of course, of the world as well, as the world moves on to other conflicts. George, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming into us here on Euronews and speaking to us on Europe Today. And thank you so much for tuning in and joining us here on Europe Today on Euronews, as always. For more news and analysis, always you can visit euronews.com. Take care and bye for now.